Hello, glad to see you all. We're just going to spend a few minutes letting people get in from the waiting room. While you're waiting, if you'd like to get familiar with your screen, there's a panel on the right side. There are, towards the bottom of the panel, there are two handouts. That's information about two upcoming talks for Gallatin Valley Earth Day in April. And there's also next to your name, there's a little hand. You'll be using that to ask a question later. But if you want to take a little time now while you're coming in, welcome. You can download those handouts right now. One of them is labeled Graywater Talk. And this is an online talk coming up on Wednesday, April 6th at 7 p.m. It's called Gallatin Valley 2022, Grape or Raisin? The Coming Water Shortage and How to Respond to It. This is by Randy Hafer, an architect from High Plains Architects. Another talk you may be interested in is Drop, Water Connects Us All. This is a virtual film screening with a discussion following about how a warming climate can have consequences for us all. It's a short film, and after that there'll be three panelists, which are all from Montana. The first panelist is Hillary Hutchinson. She's a star of the movie Drop, a fly fishing guide, and owner of Larry's Fly and Supply in Montana. The second panelist will be Hillary Lind. She is the world champion and Olympic medalist alpine skier who lives in Montana. And our third panelist we're very lucky to have is David Brooks, who is the executive director of Montana Trout Unlimited. This Drop, the film and discussion, is going to happen on Wednesday, April 13th at 7 p.m. And this is also an online event. So if you'd like to register for these events, you can just visit our website at www.gallatinvalleyearthday.org. So once again, I'm just welcoming people. We're just letting people get in from the waiting room. Just gonna start in just 1 or 2 minutes here. Just waiting for more people to join us before we begin tonight. And as you're waiting, if you just want to look at the right side of your screen, there's a little panel there, and it's going to have some options there for you to ask questions during the talk. One is a little hand. You can raise your hand by pressing the little hand by your name, and there is also a question box. If you click on that, you can type in your questions. So we have 2 minutes after 7. We're just going to let it go for 1 more minute just to let people join us before we start. But thank you. We're glad to see you tonight. And welcome. As you're waiting for those who've just come in, there are some handouts. There are 2 little symbols at the bottom of your panel, and one says Graywater Talk and the other one says Drop on it. And this is more information about 2 upcoming talks. They're both online talks. One's actually a film screening with a discussion, a panelist discussion, and these are both in April before Earth Day. So while we're waiting, I guess I'll just give a plug for our upcoming events. As I said, on Wednesday, April 6th at 7 p.m., we have a really interesting talk to explore ways that we can drastically cut our water usage using gray water systems. This is a talk by a very innovative architect, Randy Hafer from High Plains Architects, and he's named his talk Gallatin Valley 2022, Grape or Raisin? The Coming Water Shortage and How to Respond to It. I think you'll really enjoy his talk. Then the following Wednesday on April 13th at 7 p.m., we have a really interesting short film screening with a panelist discussion afterwards, including 3 Montanans, Hillary Hutchinson, a fly fishing guide and star of Drop movie, and Hillary Lind, a world and Olympic skier, and David Brooks from Montana Trout Unlimited. So you may be interested in those. You can sign up for these events to get the link at our website, which is www.gallatinvalleyearthday.org. Well, I think we've given enough time now for our waiting room people to join us. So I'd like to say welcome and good evening. We're so glad that you've joined us tonight. Gallatin Valley Earth Day is thrilled to have Dr. Richard Reddy with us tonight to talk about what can be done about climate change and how much will it cost. This talk is a follow-up to another excellent talk that we held a few weeks ago by Dr. Kathy Whitlock, where Dr. Whitlock shared with us, among other facts, the latest predictions on how a warming climate will impact our snow and water. Now, if you missed it or if you'd like to view it again, you can view a recording of this talk by going to our website, gallatinvalleyearthday.org, and clicking on the YouTube tab on the website, and there you'll find her talk. So my name is Ann Reddy, and I'm the chair of the Gallatin Valley Earth Day Committee. Gallatin Valley Earth Day's theme this year is Celebrating Water Stewardship, Past, Present, and Future. Now, we chose this theme both because 2022 is the 50th anniversary of the Clean Water Act, and because we are facing some difficult challenges with our water right now and in the future. Our unprecedented drought, a warming climate, and pollution in our rivers are all issues facing us today. The future also holds concerns. The city of Bozeman estimates that we will not have enough water for our growing population by 2033. With this in mind, we are glad you have joined us to learn about solutions that will reduce emissions that are warming our climate and threatening our snow and water supply. These policy solutions will be presented and explained in tonight's talk by Dr. Richard Reddy. But before we proceed, I wanted to thank our premier sponsors, Gallatin Subaru, Volkswagen of Bozeman, and the City of Bozeman, and our stewards, Sacagawea Audubon Society, Bridger Bowl Ski Area, Happy Trash Can, and Root Cellar Foods. Without their generous support, we would not be able to bring you tonight's program. Also, a big thanks to Sacagawea Audubon Society for providing their webinar platform for tonight's program. And lastly, this program is only running smoothly due to Lorene Reed's excellent technical support. Before I introduce Dr. Richard Reddy, I wanted to let you know, in case you didn't hear in the initial greetings, that you will have an opportunity to ask questions during Dr. Reddy's talk, and he will answer these at the end of his talk. So once again, there are two ways that you can submit your question. The first one is to look up on your side panel, and there's a little hand next to your name, so you click on that. And then once you do that, at an appropriate point, we will call your name, unmute you, and you can ask your question personally. A second option is for you to go to the question section, click on that, type in your question, and we will read the question for Dr. Reddy to answer. With that said, I'm very pleased to introduce Dr. Richard Reddy. Lorene, you can turn on his screen. As a disclaimer, Dr. Reddy is my husband. Dr. Richard Reddy is a professor of environmental and natural resource economics at Montana State University. His research centers on how people benefit from the environment and natural resources and how they impact them. His research topics have included environmental health, climate change, invasive species, landscape change, and outdoor recreation. From 2013 until 2018, he served on the EPA Science Advisory Boards Environmental Economics Advisory Committee. So now, Dr. Richard Reddy, take it away.
Okay, thanks a lot, Ann. Thanks, Lorene. And thanks to everyone who tuned in tonight. Let me first give you a roadmap of what I plan to talk about today. I imagine that many of you saw Kathy Whitlock's talk 2 weeks ago. If you didn't, I recommend you go to the Gallatin Valley Earth Day website and watch the recording. She did a great job explaining some of the science about climate change and some of the impacts that we'll see from climate change and that we're already seeing. So I won't go too much into that today. Some of you may also have seen a talk I gave about climate policy last September. I'll try not to repeat myself too much from that talk, but I do plan to give some updates on what's going on the policy front. So tonight, I first want to go give you an overview of where we are in terms of greenhouse gas emissions and concentrations, and where we need to be if we want to avoid the worst consequences of climate change. Next, I'll talk about the actions that we need to take to reduce greenhouse gas emissions to net zero or net negative. Third, I'll talk about the policies that we could adopt to get people to take those actions. Fourth, I'll talk about what it'll cost to get us to net zero emissions. And then finally, I'll talk about the cost to society if we don't take actions to limit climate change. Now, the Paris Accords adopted a goal of limiting global temperature rise to 1.5 degrees Celsius. The idea is that keeping warming below 1.5 degrees will avoid the worst impacts of climate change. But we've already experienced about 1.1 degrees of warming, and the rate of warming has been speeding up. So we don't have a lot of room left to maneuver. That 1.1 degrees of warming has already caused sea level rise, increased severe weather, drought, floods, wildfire, coral reef loss, and so on. The reasons we've already experienced 1.1 degrees of warming is because we've been emitting CO2 and other greenhouse gases faster than natural processes can remove them. This graph shows our emissions of CO2 and where it goes, called sinks. Emissions are shown as positive values, while sinks are shown as negative values. All emissions must go somewhere, so total emissions equals total sinks. You can see that most of our emissions come from burning fossil fuels. And about half of those emissions are soaked up by the ocean and land. But we emit more each year than the ocean and land can take up. So the blue region in the graph shows how much of our emissions ends up adding to the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere. Because we keep adding more and more CO2 than the planet can absorb, the concentration of CO2 in the atmosphere keeps going up. And consequently, global temperatures keep rising. This graph shows how the concentration of CO2 and global temperatures have risen since 1850, about the start of the Industrial Revolution. We're now at about 420 parts per million of CO2 in the atmosphere, up from about 280 prior to the Industrial Revolution. And we've seen, as I said, about 1.1 degrees of warming. But how much additional warming we experience depends critically on our current and future emissions of greenhouse gases. These graphs show different possible futures or scenarios. The first panel shows the rate at which we emit greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. The second panel shows the concentration of greenhouse gases in the atmosphere for each scenario. And the third shows the projected warming under two of the scenarios, with shading representing uncertainty. Now, the 8.5 scenario, which is called RCP 8.5, is considered a worst case scenario where we increase coal burning and don't transition to renewables. In that case, the left panel shows emissions continue to rise throughout the rest of the century. The center panel shows that the atmospheric concentration of greenhouse gases more than doubles over the next 80 years. And the right panel shows that global temperatures increase by about 8 degrees Fahrenheit, or about 4.5 degrees Celsius, by year 2100. Now, to give you some perspective, 20,000 years ago, the planet was about 4.5 degrees Celsius cooler than it is now, and Boston was under a mile of ice. So it's hard to imagine what a planet would look like if it were 4.5 degrees Celsius warmer. Now, in the 2.6 scenario, we phase out fossil fuel use and transition to carbon-free energy sources. Under this scenario, emissions start declining very soon. In around year 2050, the planet's ability to absorb CO2 matches our emissions. And after that point, concentrations start to decline. We reach net zero around year 2070 and have net negative emissions after that. Toward the end of the century, global temperatures actually start to decline a little bit because concentrations are going down. Now, our current path, what we've been doing, is somewhere between the 6.0 and the 8.5 paths. If all countries did what they promised to do in the Paris Accords, we'd be on about the 4.5 path, with projected warming of around 5.2 degrees Fahrenheit or 2.9 degrees Celsius. So what would it take to keep warming under 1.5 degrees Celsius? Well, a recent IPCC report explored emissions pathways that would do that. There are several different ways to do it, but all of the pathways require that emissions start decreasing very soon, that emissions reach net zero around mid-century, and that emissions then become net negative so that we can soak up some of our past emissions and bring CO2 concentrations back down. A report that was released just today finds that in order to keep warming below 1.5 degrees, high-income countries like the United States must stop all fossil fuel production within the next 12 years. Now, US emissions have been declining since around 2005. This is mostly due to a transition in the electricity sector away from coal and toward natural gas and renewables. But we're certainly not on track to end fossil fuel production within 12 years. And global emissions are still rising due to increases in emissions outside of the US and the EU. So these curves need to start heading down if we're going to keep within our climate goals. So that's kind of the current situation. So how do we reduce our emissions? Well, I'm sure you've seen graphics like this one with titles like, "How can you reduce your carbon footprint?" They include easy things you can do that don't make much difference and hard things that make a bigger difference. But the focus here is on personal decisions by households, which is only part of the equation. Let me work through an example of an action that a household can take to reduce their carbon footprint in order to demonstrate some important issues that we need to think about when we discuss personal decisions by households. There's a lot of talk about getting people to use heat pumps instead of natural gas to heat their homes. Now, I've put together some very rough numbers for a typical home in Montana. Don't quote me on these numbers. They're very much back of the envelope and are intended to illustrate some issues. If you heat your home with natural gas, CO2 is emitted from the exhaust pipe from your furnace. If you use a heat pump, CO2 is emitted when the electricity is generated. And I'm using statewide numbers about carbon emissions per kilowatt hour of electricity used. You can see that right now in Montana, switching from a natural gas furnace to a heat pump will reduce your carbon footprint, but cost you more. Some people will do this because they care about climate change. But if you want a lot of people to do this, you're either going to have to force them to, for example, by banning new gas hookups like they're doing in New York City, or give them an incentive to make the switch. That's the first point I want to highlight. Some of the actions we want people to take to reduce their carbon footprint will cost them money, and we need to figure out how we're going to get them to do those actions. But individual actions are only part of the solution. If we transition the grid to carbon-free electricity, we can get greenhouse gas emissions from heat pumps down to essentially zero. But that's beyond the control of an individual household. That's the second point I want to highlight. We cannot rely on individual actions alone. We have to make changes to the entire energy system. And we have to make sure that we green the grid without driving up the price of electricity, or we won't be able to convince people to make the switch away from natural gas. The third point I want to highlight is that advances in technology are really important. If I had talked about heat pumps in Montana 10 years ago, people would have thought I was crazy. But heat pump performance in cold weather has improved dramatically over the last 10 years and will continue to improve. That makes switching to heat pumps in a place like Montana easier and easier to do over time. As technology improves, it gets easier and easier to reduce our emissions. So what things do we need to do to bring our emissions down to net zero? Well, the easiest way to reduce emissions is to use less energy. For example, by switching to LED light bulbs and improving insulation in homes and commercial buildings. Now, very often improving efficiency saves money, so it's a win-win. For example, insulating your home is one of the best, cheapest ways you can reduce your carbon footprint and saves you money over the long run. But some households still don't do it because they can't afford the upfront cost, or because they don't plan to live in a house long enough to get the payback, or because they rent their home. Now, these are barriers we need to overcome. The second thing we need to do is to decarbonize the electricity supply system by building out emissions-free production capacity like wind power, solar power, and possibly nuclear power. We've been making a lot of progress on reducing emissions from the electricity sector, mostly due to the switch from coal to natural gas and renewables. But that switch has been driven primarily by cheap natural gas and the falling cost of wind and solar. The biggest impediment to pushing the grid to 100% carbon-free is not the technology. We have the technology. Right now, it's the fact that natural gas is so cheap. While we transition our electricity supply to carbon-free sources, we want to replace things that burn fossil fuels with versions that use electricity. So this is what we call electrification. So for example, replace conventional cars with electric vehicles and gas cooktops with induction cooktops and gas furnaces with heat pumps. There will be some fossil fuel uses where electrification is not practical, for example, air travel. There we'll want to rely on net zero fuels such as biofuels or hydrogen made using carbon-free electricity. It'll take time to make this switch. Cars and trucks last around 15 years on average, so it will take around that long to switch out our fleet. That means we want to get started right away. Now, if we electrify everything that is currently powered by fossil fuels, we're going to have to expand the electricity sector dramatically. It's estimated that we'll need to just about double our electricity supply by 2050 to do this. Now, it took us 140 years to build our current electricity system. So we have to build something twice that big in the next 30 years. That's going to require a lot of investment and is going to involve siting a lot of generation and storage facilities and transmission lines. Now, carbon sequestration means taking carbon dioxide out of the atmosphere and putting it somewhere where it won't escape again. Now, in Iceland, in the left-hand picture there, you can see a facility that takes carbon dioxide out of the air, dissolves it in water, and then injects it underground into rock where it forms a mineral. This is happening now. It's not future tech. It takes a lot of energy to do that. Fortunately, Iceland has a lot of geothermal electricity it can use. It's also very expensive. A cheaper approach is to capture CO2 that's produced from burning fossil fuels before it reaches the air and then injecting it underground. This approach, called carbon capture and sequestration, is controversial. First, it hasn't been successfully done on a large scale. Second, there's a worry that fossil fuel advocates will rely on this technology to argue in favor of continued use of fossil fuels. But in some cases, it may be cheaper to burn, for example, natural gas and capture the emissions than to generate electricity from wind and solar. So it needs to be considered as part of a total system. But there are also natural processes that sequester carbon. Plants will move carbon dioxide out of the air and into the soil, where it will stay if we don't disturb it. Trees sequester a great deal of carbon in their wood and in the soil, particularly older, larger trees. We can increase the rate at which plants and trees sequester carbon by adopting sustainable farming and forestry practices that encourage carbon storage in soils and trees. There's also a project here at Montana State University that's looking at the feasibility of growing biomass crops, burning them to produce electricity, capturing the CO2 emitted, and then sequestering it. This system, called bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, would produce electricity with net negative emissions because CO2 is being taken out of the air by the crops and then being sequestered. At the same time, there are things that people do that release carbon stored in soils and trees. For example, rainforests are being cleared and burned in order to create pasture. This releases all of the carbon that's stored in those trees. And grasslands and pastures are being plowed up to grow crops. This releases a lot of the carbon that's stored in the soil. We want to stop this kind of land conversion so that to the extent we can do so and still grow sufficient food. Finally, we need to eliminate emissions of other greenhouse gases. Methane is being emitted from leaking natural gas wells and pipelines, abandoned oil and gas wells, from livestock production, and from landfills. Nitrous oxide is coming from fertilizers and manure. These greenhouse gases are more powerful at creating warming than CO2. Unfortunately, they don't last as long in the atmosphere. So now that we have some idea what needs to be done, we can ask which things are cheap to do and which things are expensive. It helps to put each action on a scale where we calculate the cost of reducing greenhouse gas emissions per ton of carbon dioxide avoided or removed. Now this graph shows what is called an abatement cost curve. Each rectangle represents an action that can be taken to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. The width of each rectangle tells us how much emissions reduction we can achieve using that action. The height tells us how much that action will cost per ton of emissions removed. Now, some actions have negative costs. These are mostly actions that improve efficiency. These are the win-win solutions that reduce emissions and save money. They show up as rectangles that point downward in the graph because they save money. But some actions do cost money to implement. These are the rectangles that point upwards. For example, we're not going to get to 100% carbon-free electricity without paying something to get there. That's particularly true when you consider that we're going to have to double the size of the electricity sector. The first thing to point out about this graph is that the total emissions reductions of 38 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year is pretty close to our current global emissions. So if we do everything on the graph, we will reach net zero emissions. The second thing to point out is that all of the actions in this graph are things we can do right now with existing technology. So we can achieve net zero emissions with our current technology. I want to again touch on the role of individual actions versus collective actions. Now, I've underlined several actions that individual households can take. Many of these have negative costs. They save you money. But the thing that strikes me is that the rectangles that go with these actions are all pretty skinny. They don't do much in total. They're certainly worth doing, but if we rely on individual actions alone, we're not going to come anywhere near where we need to be. Now, the fatter rectangles are associated with things that need to be done by industry or governments. And industry isn't going to do expensive things unless governments entice them to or force them to. Next, I want to highlight actions that have to do with land use. These represent a large portion of the total. We tend to focus so much on wind and solar and electric cars, we forget about how we use our land is at least as important. Here we need to think about how we get landowners to use their land in ways that reduce carbon losses and increases carbon storage. Finally, I want to point out that carbon capture and sequestration approaches are currently among the most expensive ways we have to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. But they may still be necessary to get to net zero emissions. And with ongoing research, we can expect these costs to come down over time. So how much will it cost? Well, you can calculate the total cost of getting to net zero emissions by adding together the areas of all of the rectangles with positive cost and then subtracting the areas of all of the rectangles with negative costs. Now, I want to point out that the costs are going down fast. Now, the graph on the left shows that solar power in 2020 was 85% cheaper than it was in 2009. Wind has also gotten cheaper, though not by as much. And the cost of battery storage is falling even faster. The right-hand graph shows that as batteries get cheaper, electric vehicles get cheaper, and eventually cheaper than conventional vehicles because electric motors are cheaper to make than gas-powered engines. So how do we get individual households, electricity generators, trucking companies, industry, landowners, and so on to do all of these things? That's the policy question. In a place like China, where the government owns all of the energy resources and all of the electricity generating infrastructure, the government can make changes directly. Even in places like the UK, the government owns all the oil and gas resources, so they can simply decide to stop producing. In many countries, electricity generation capacity is owned by the government, so they can decide to replace fossil fuel generating stations with renewable sources. In the United States, however, most of our oil and gas resources are privately owned, as is our electricity generating and transmission capacity. The government doesn't have the power to mandate the kinds of actions we've been talking about. Climate policy is the combination of government actions and rules and incentives that the government uses to try to get people and businesses to do things differently. Now, I've highlighted with these three pictures that policy is the combination of laws passed by Congress, actions taken by the executive branch to implement those laws, and decisions by the courts, which have been playing an increasingly important role lately. Before I get into talking about specific climate policies, I want to give you an update on legislation that I talked about back in September. When I talked back in September, there were two bills that were floating around in Congress that looked like they were going to pass soon. The first was the bipartisan infrastructure bill. It included $1.2 trillion in spending on roads and bridges and other forms of infrastructure. It's interesting to us because it included a lot of money for climate adaptation, such as money to make roads less flood prone. And it included money for things like charging stations for electric vehicles. All told, this bill included more money aimed at climate change than any prior law. Now, it passed in November, and money is actually starting to flow. The second bill I talked about is the Build Back Better bill. This is a special bill related to the budget that only requires 50 votes in the Senate to pass. The bill that was being discussed included programs to try to get electricity generators to invest in renewable energy, a tax on methane emissions from natural gas wells and pipelines, a program to hire young people to help communities deal with climate change, and a lot of money for things like tax incentives to build renewable generation, insulate homes, purchase electric vehicles, and so on. It also included a lot of money for social programs such as universal pre-kindergarten, child tax credits, and expanded Medicaid and Medicare coverage. Back when I talked in September, the expectation was that this bill would pass the Senate sometime in October. In order to get 50 votes in the Senate, and in particular, in order to get Senator Joe Manchin from West Virginia to vote for it, the bill kept shrinking and shrinking, and it never did pass. There are attempts now to resurrect parts of the bill, but there's no time frame for that, and it's still not clear what could pass the Senate. So what kind of policy tools does the federal government have in its toolkit to try to get households and businesses to move toward net zero emissions? We can think about federal climate policy as falling into three categories: spending money, making executive branch decisions, and changing incentives. First, the federal government spends a lot of money, and how it does that spending matters. For example, the Postal Service plans to buy 165,000 new delivery trucks over the next decade. Right now, it only plans for 10% of those delivery trucks to be electric. And the gas-powered trucks don't get very good mileage. Delivery trucks last a long time, so this is committing us to using gasoline for a long time. The Post Office says it would cost $3.3 billion to go all electric. Now, the Build Back Better bill included money for this, and there are people in Congress trying to get that money now. This is just one example of the many purchasing decisions the federal government makes and the implications they can have on emissions. In addition to purchases, the federal government gives away money to help reduce energy use. There are grants and tax credits for people and businesses who invest in efficiency improvements. There are tax credits for buying electric vehicles, and so on. Again, the Build Back Better bill had a lot of money for these kinds of grants and tax credits. Giveaways are popular in Congress, so it's not unlikely that money for some of those programs will be funded in some form in the future. Next, there's a strong case to be made in favor of government funding of research and development. We can't rely on industry to do all of the research and development because we want the benefits from new discoveries to help everyone, not just the company making the discovery. Part of the reason why solar and wind are now outcompeting coal in electricity is because of prior research funded by the federal government. There's still a lot of money going into researching technologies to reduce emissions. For example, the Department of Energy recently funded $72 million for research on carbon capture and sequestration and direct air capture. Next, the federal government helps fund demonstration projects for new technologies that are too big and too risky for private investors to go it alone. For example, the government's providing funds to build new modular nuclear power plants and new facilities to capture carbon from fossil fuels and sequester it. The hope is that by helping fund the first few facilities, we can demonstrate that the technology is feasible, and then private investors will step in to fund subsequent projects. Finally, the federal government gives businesses loans to try to get them established. Now, everyone's heard about Solyndra. That was a business that got a $535 million federal loan to build solar cells. It went bankrupt, and the federal government lost most of the money in the loan. But people don't remember that the same loan program also funded Tesla, which is now the 6th most valuable company in the world and pretty much established the market for electric vehicles. The loan programs are supposed to work this way. They invest in high-risk, high-payoff companies that private investors are too nervous to fund. Now, second, the executive branch makes a lot of decisions when it implements the laws passed by Congress, and how it makes those decisions matters. First, the executive branch writes regulations. Now, all regulations must be tied to a law passed by Congress. So, for example, fuel economy standards are under the 2007 Energy Independence and Security Act. Greenhouse gas regulations are under the 1990 Clean Air Act amendments. Next, the executive branch issues permits allowing companies to do things. Now, these permits are also tied to specific laws passed by Congress. So, for example, the Dakota Access Pipeline permits that were recently revoked were mostly tied to the Clean Water Act and the Rivers and Harbors Act. The Keystone XL pipeline permit that was recently revoked was tied to the fact that the pipeline crossed the Canada-US border, so the State Department had to approve it. Now, the third type of decision the federal government does is it owns a lot of land that contains energy resources. But it doesn't itself drill for oil or dig for coal, and it doesn't build solar farms. Instead, private companies buy leases to be able to do those things on federal lands and on the Outer Continental Shelf. The federal government must decide which areas to offer for lease. Now, in all three cases, the federal government has to make decisions about how stringent regulations should be, should permits be issued, and what areas should be leased. More and more, the courts have been telling the government that it has to consider climate change impacts from those decisions. The main way agencies have been doing that is by using a metric called the social cost of carbon. That's an estimate of the additional damage that would occur if we emit 1 more ton of carbon dioxide. Now, the social cost of carbon was first estimated in 2010 at $43 per ton. That was the number that was used, for example, to justify the Clean Power Plan under the Obama administration. The Trump administration revised the estimate to $1 per ton. This would obviously change a lot of federal decisions in favor of allowing more emissions. The Biden administration increased the social cost of carbon again and ordered a new estimate to be developed. Now, a bunch of attorneys generals from several states sued over the social cost of carbon. One of the key points of contention was whether the social cost of carbon estimate should include damages that occur outside the United States. A big reason the Biden administration's number is so much bigger than the Trump administration's number is that the Biden administration's number includes global damages, while the Trump administration's number only includes damages that would occur within the US. Well, on February 11th of this year, a federal judge in Louisiana blocked the federal government from using the $51 estimate. This threw a big monkey wrench into a wide range of ongoing federal decisions. For example, the Interior Department had to cancel a planned oil and gas lease sale in Wyoming that would have offered 180,000 acres for leasing. Last Wednesday, the U.S. Court of Appeals said that the administration could continue to use the $51 estimate while the case goes through the courts. Now, it's not entirely clear what happens next. The federal government can again use the $51 estimate, but any decisions it makes based on that number could be in jeopardy depending on what the courts ultimately decide. Now, this is one that's probably going to end up at the Supreme Court. Now, the third main type of policy tool that the federal government uses is to change incentives. These are the carrots and sticks of policy. We reward people for doing things we want them to do, and we punish them for doing things we don't want them to do. For example, we give positive incentives to companies that install renewable generation capacity. A production tax credit is a payment to a company for every kilowatt hour of renewable energy it produces. These keep expiring and getting reestablished. The graph that I shows that the rate of new installations of renewable energy production is very sensitive to changes to the production tax credit. When the production tax credit expires, new installations go down. They pick back up again when it is reinstated. Now, the production tax credit for renewable energy expired at the end of 2021. The Build Back Better bill included money to reinstate it. Another tax credit to encourage renewables is the investment tax credit. Companies can get up to 30% tax credit for investments in renewables. This credit is set to expire over the next 2 years. Households can also get an investment tax credit up to 26% for things like solar panels, efficient windows, a new heat pump, etc. This gets to the issue that I mentioned earlier, that actions that reduce energy use may not always save a household money, so we have to give them a little help. There's also a tax credit you can get for carbon capture. If you capture carbon dioxide and pump it underground and store it geologically, you can get up to $50 per ton. Build Back Better would have increased and extended this tax credit. So those are all carrots, positive incentives to get you to do things we want you to do. Next, we have the sticks, negative incentives to get you to not do things we don't want you to do. Now, the cleanest, most comprehensive stick we could use is carbon pricing. The idea behind carbon pricing is to make it expensive to release greenhouse gases from burning fossil fuels. This will give companies and households a short-run incentive to release less greenhouse gases and a long-run incentive to invent new technology that results in lower future emissions. Now, the map here shows countries and regions that have adopted different carbon pricing systems, and there are two main approaches. In an emission trading system, also called cap and trade, emitters are allocated permits that allow emissions. Companies that have extra permits can sell them, and companies that need extra permits must buy them. This means that for every ton of emissions a company emits, it must give up a permit it could have sold or buy a new permit. Either way, there's a cost to the company of emitting greenhouse gases. Now, there are existing emission trading systems in the European Union, California, New England, and there's a new one starting up in China. Now, a carbon tax is a tax charged to all emitters when the fossil fuel is taken out of the ground. Several countries and regions have carbon taxes, and the prices charged vary a lot. So, for example, in Argentina, they have a tax of $6 per ton of carbon. In British Columbia, it's $36 a ton. Sweden is the outlier here. Their carbon tax is $137 per ton. Now, of all of the developing countries in the world, only US and Australia lack some form of national carbon pricing. Now, finally, we get to the question, how much will it all cost? Here, it's important to limit ourselves to estimates that have been developed recently. The cost of emission reductions have been falling so fast that any estimates that are from more than a couple years ago are already out of date. Now, I'm going to talk about two recent studies that look at the cost of getting to net zero emissions for the United States. These studies construct a big model of the country's economy and its energy system, and then ask, how do we get to net zero emissions at the least possible cost? The first study found that the US could achieve net zero emission by 2050 at an annual cost of between 0.2% and 1.2% of our GDP. To give you some perspective, real GDP in the United States grows by about 2 to 3% on average each year. So the cost of getting to net zero emissions is less than 1 year's worth of economic growth. Now, this study also found that achieving net zero emissions at lowest cost required a heavy reliance on renewable generation and electrification, and required a lot of new electricity infrastructure, especially with regards to transmission. Now, this allows us to move electricity from places where the wind is blowing and the sun is shining to places where it's not. And the study authors point out that there will likely be a lot of local opposition to that infrastructure. That's a social and political issue we're going to have to deal with. A second study found that getting to net zero requires a very large upfront investment in new production and transmission infrastructure, but having made that investment, we'll see lower annual costs because our production facilities don't require fuel and maintenance costs are lower. Their estimate of cost is slightly higher, between 1 and 1.6% of GDP. Now, both studies found that a transition to a net zero energy system would cost money, but is relatively affordable. And the costs are actually lower than what we're paying now in high oil and natural gas prices caused by the war in Ukraine and other supply chain problems. Now, I did a back of the envelope calculation and found that recent increases in oil and natural gas prices are costing US businesses and households an amount equal to about 2% of our GDP. Now, transitioning to a renewables-based system would insulate us from that kind of energy price volatility. Some other consistent themes from these studies: the transition will cost a lot up front, but save us money later. The cost of the transition is falling all the time as technology improves. The more flexibility you allow in energy sources, the cheaper the transition will be. Both models found that it made sense to include some nuclear power and some carbon capture and sequestration. It's important to point out that the cost estimates in these studies don't take into account other savings that would occur with the transition away from fossil fuels. The biggest savings is from the decrease in health impacts that we'd see from decreased exposure to pollutants like particulates and ozone. Finally, both studies emphasize that to get to net zero emissions is going to require incentives. Businesses and households are not going to do it by themselves. So if it's going to cost on the order of 1% of GDP annually to reach net zero emissions, how does that compare to the costs of not addressing climate change? Now, there have been a number of studies that have tried to estimate the economic costs of climate change. And these studies focus on the so-called climate exposed sectors, the sectors that we expect are most sensitive to changes in climate. They try to estimate the impact on each sector and then add them all up. The graph shown here shows different estimates of the global damage from climate change as a percent of global GDP. And there are a few things to notice. First, some of the estimates show negative damages. That is, that the study found that the climate change would actually be a net positive. There's only a few of those studies. Most studies find that climate change would result in damages. Second, the green line that shows the averages across the studies shows that as temperature rises, damages increase at an increasing rate. So 2 degrees of warming is worse than 1 degree, but 3 degrees is much worse than 2 degrees, and 4 degrees is really, really bad. Now, drilling down to individual studies, we find that there's a great deal of variability across different studies. Now, the first one, the DICE model, is a model constructed by William Nordhaus, who received the Nobel Prize for his work. But it's based on older estimates. If you compare the damage estimates from the DICE model to a recent estimate from the reinsurance group Swiss Re, you can see that the range of estimates is quite wide. And these studies also find that climate impacts will be harder on poorer countries than on richer countries, and countries that are more reliant on agriculture will be harder hit. Now, it should be noted that these studies focus on the climate-exposed sectors only, which only make up about 15% of the economy. There's more recent evidence that other industries, for example, manufacturing, are affected by climate, particularly in countries where factories aren't air-conditioned. Most of these estimates include health impacts, but only some include recreational impacts, and none include ecosystem impacts. So we think that these tend to be underestimates of the true costs of climate change. The second point is that there's been a recent shift in thinking about impacts at lower levels of warming. Up until recently, it was the consensus view that a small amount of warming, say less than 1 degree Celsius, would have essentially zero net impact because positive impacts would balance negative impacts. And that view's been changing as we see more and more the damages that are being caused by 1 degree of warming. And I expect over time, new research will give us larger estimates of the damages, particularly associated with small and moderate levels of warming. But even with existing estimates, it's clear that the cost of transitioning to a net zero emission system is less than the cost of not doing so. Now, let me finish by going through some of the reasons I'm pessimistic that much will get done to address climate change, and then some reasons why I'm optimistic. My first reason for pessimism is the polarization that we're experiencing in our political system. Over the last 40 years, both political parties have become more polarized. This makes it very difficult to get big things done in Congress. And the courts are increasingly limiting what the president can do by himself. So we need congressional action to do anything big. My second reason for pessimism is that there are very powerful players who make their money from fossil fuels. In 2018, the World Bank estimated that total future profits from fossil fuel production was $39 trillion. Now, if we successfully force those resources to stay underground, powerful people will lose those profits. And those powerful people are working very hard to make sure that doesn't happen. My third reason for pessimism is that it's very hard to get countries to work together on problems that require sacrifice. One of the biggest challenges for international agreement is the inequality across countries and the cost of achieving net zero emissions. Developing countries would face costs that require a higher percentage of their GDP than developed countries. That's been a consistent sticking point in international negotiations. How much should developing countries be expected to do, and who's going to pay? Now for the reasons I'm optimistic. My first reason is that people are more aware of climate change. 5 years ago, it was rare to see climate change mentioned in the local newspaper. Now there's hardly a day when there isn't some mention of it somewhere in a news story. The press is talking about it more, politicians are talking about it more, even people who are trying to prevent action are talking about climate change in a different way now. My second reason for optimism is that we already have the technologies we need to achieve net zero emissions. They exist today. Third, the costs of green technologies are coming down fast. This is one of my favorite graphs. It shows the projections of the cost of solar energy made in different years by the International Energy Agency. Each dashed line shows a projection of costs. Every time the IEA made a forecast, the actual costs fell much faster than the projections predicted. Remember that one of the barriers to action is the value of the reserves held by powerful companies. As renewable technologies get cheaper and cheaper, the value of those reserves falls, making it easier and easier to keep them in the ground. But it's important that we put in place incentives for people to make changes, and those incentives will stimulate research, development, and innovation that will speed up the technological progress. Fourth, the transition has already started. Here's another graph that shows projected futures versus actual experience. In this case, the IEA projected how much solar would be installed each year. In every projection, the IEA predicted that the rate of new solar installations would be flat. In every case, installations increased dramatically year over year. Finally, new science from the IPCC gives reason for optimism. The conventional wisdom has been that some amount of future warming is baked in due to the long lags in the physical processes. However, there's a new realization that as soon as we get emissions to net zero, the planet's natural processes will start sequestering carbon and global temperatures will stabilize. Now, the red line in this graph shows what temperature will do if we stabilize CO2 concentrations at current levels, that means emitting CO2 at the same rate it's being absorbed by the ocean and land. The blue line shows what will happen if we achieve net zero emissions, at which point atmospheric CO2 concentrations start to decline. As soon as we reach net zero emissions, temperatures will stop rising. Additional warming is not as baked in as we thought. So personally, I'm not very optimistic that the US will make major changes in regulations and incentives in the next couple of years. I just don't see the political path. But we're investing in research and development that will make it easier to act in the future. So I'm optimistic for changes in the mid and long term. So I'm afraid I don't think we will stay below 1.5 degrees of warming. The UN Secretary General recently said pretty much the same thing. But I think it's perfectly possible to keep warming below 2 degrees. That much global warming will cause damage and irreversible changes. Species will go extinct, we'll have droughts and floods, people will die. That's already happening. But we have the tools to keep it from getting much, much worse, and to eventually even reverse warming and get CO2 levels back down closer to their pre-industrial levels. We can do it. I'm confident that we will. It's just a question of how long it will take for us to get serious about addressing climate change and how much damage we do by waiting. So I'm going to stop there. I hope I left a few minutes for questions. Thank you for tuning in tonight. If we don't get to all of the questions, you can contact me at the email address there that's on the screen. So Anne, do we have any questions? Anne?
Whoops, hello.
Oh, there you
Sorry,
are.
I just realized I clicked my video instead of, I'm going to get rid of me and click my, okay, so I'm looking through the questions and I have a first question for you, Rich. In 2019, 3,500 US economists, including yourself and 14 other economists from Montana State and the University of Montana, signed a joint statement promoting carbon pricing with a cashback dividend and a carbon border adjustment as the most cost-effective US climate policy. Can you elaborate on why you think this is a good policy?
Sure. So here we're talking about the policy tools. How do we get people to do the actions that we want them to do? Now, when you compare carbon pricing to other approaches like tax credits or regulations, tax credits and regulations are all very piecemeal. They target one issue at a time. So we're trying to get people to buy more electric vehicles. We're trying to get people to install better windows. But a carbon price is going to be much more systemic. It's going to affect all decisions. It's very hard to piece by piece get everything covered. A carbon price does that for us. So that's the first reason. The second reason is it's going to be effective. There's been a lot of modeling on this that shows that a carbon price will push the system in the direction we want it to go. It won't do everything we want it to do. We're still going to need good public transportation. We're still going to need to do something about land use change. We're still going to need to do something about leaks from abandoned oil and gas wells. A carbon price won't fix those problems, but it will do a lot of the things we need it to do. Now you mentioned a dividend. One of the things that happens with a carbon price is if you put a tax on carbon, you collect a lot of money. And then the question becomes, what do you do with all that money? So there's a number of things you can do with it, and different places that have implemented carbon pricing have done different things with the money. One thing you can do is you can spend it. You can spend it on things that you think will make the environment better. You could use it to cut other taxes. One interesting approach is to use the money that's generated and give it back to the people who are in the country in what we call a dividend. And you could target it to low-income people. You could get everyone the same amount of money. That's going to help counteract the effect that the carbon price is going to have on low-income households. The carbon price would hit low-income households harder. So if we give money back, we can actually help those low-income households deal with those higher energy prices. The last thing is the carbon border adjustment. Whether we do a carbon price, whether we do regulation, anything we do that increases the cost of, say, manufacturing in a country, if the same things don't happen in other countries, then we're going to put our industry at a competitive disadvantage. So a border carbon adjustment is an import tariff that accounts for the differences in the costs of production. And the idea is there to level the playing field so that we can do these things in a way that doesn't put our businesses at a disadvantage in international marketplaces. Okay.
Okay, we have a question here from David. He says that the UK scientists estimated today, in fact, 450 hectares per megawatt from biomass, but 0.3 hectare per megawatt from wind. The UK does not have sufficient arable land to feed the population with growing fuel. What about the USA?
No, biomass is a big issue, and one of the relying on biomass as a way to get to carbon neutral electricity is going to require a tremendous amount of land. We've already seen that with the attempts to encourage ethanol production. So a lot of corn is grown to be used to make ethanol, and the land that is being used to grow that corn has displaced other crops, for example, soybeans. And so what we see is that some of that production has moved to Brazil, where it's resulted in cutting down of the rainforest so that they can grow soybeans to make up for the loss that we've had in the United States because we're all growing corn for ethanol. So that's a really important issue. And it's something that the team here at MSU that's working on the biomass problem is trying to address, is that, where is this land going to come from? What are we going to give up? Every issue that we deal with has got trade-offs. There are no magic wands here that have only good impacts. So that's an example of one where we really have to be careful about how we approach things. If we just blindly give incentives to biomass, for example, we can have some very bad unintended consequences.
Okay, well, I am looking through here, and please, if anyone has a question, feel free to click the little hand next to your name, and we'll unmute you. You can unmute yourself and ask the question yourself. I'm looking through, and I'm not seeing any little hands up at the moment, but oh, we got a few questions coming in on the question box. So let me go here. Bring this up. Okay, so Alex asks, says, thank you for this excellent presentation. What was the $39 trillion referring to? The profits this year of the fossil fuel industry? Also, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce has stated that, quote, inaction is not an option, end quote, when it comes to tackling climate change. I just encourage people to talk with their Chamber of Commerce in their towns and encourage them to support the U.S. Chamber's statement. So getting back to the question for you, Rich, what was the $39 trillion referring to?
The $39 trillion, that is basically it's the value of the resource sitting underground minus the cost of getting it out of the ground. So it's kind of the profit you could get if you took it all out of the ground. So the other way to think about it is the market capitalization of all of the companies of all of the resources that are owned by all of these companies. And your point about talking to chambers of commerce, local governments, county governments, state governments is very well taken. It's not just the federal government that's involved here, and we need to be, thinking at all levels.
Okay, Thomas Allen, would you unmute yourself so you could ask, you have your hand up, and we'd love to have you ask your question of Rich. Go ahead, Thomas. Are you there?
Oh, can you hear me?
Yeah, now we can.
All right, great. Um, so I I guess living here in Montana, I've heard from some people who I guess would consider themselves libertarians that they feel that climate change does need to be addressed, but they disagree with it being done through either government policy or subsidies. And so I guess I just wonder what uh, they would prefer that things have sort of a natural consequence, that people who pollute naturally face consequences, but that's not how things have played out. So I guess I'm wondering, how do you either talk with those people and get them on the side of supporting uh, regulation and subsidies for cleaner energy and more sustainable practices,
Well, that's one of
or
the
is there a
arguments that's
way
made in favor of using
for
carbon
market to work?
pricing. Oh, sorry. That's one of the arguments that's used and made in favor of carbon pricing versus, say, regulations and subsidies. So you mentioned
Hmm.
the idea of consequences. The idea is that when you emit a ton of carbon dioxide, you are imposing damages on everybody else. In economics, we call that an externality. Um, and so the idea is, if you're going to impose damages on other people, you should pay the value of those damages. So the example I like to give is, if you go out in your driveway and use spray paint and paint something on your driveway, and it drifts across to your neighbor and gets on their car, you have to pay to get their car repainted. You have to pay for the damages you created. So if you go out and if you burn fossil fuels, you are creating damages for your neighbors. Your neighbors happen to be everyone who lives on the globe. You should pay for those damages. So that's kind of the argument, I guess the moral or the intuitive argument in favor of carbon pricing, and particularly in favor of a carbon tax. So I think that approach might be a little bit more palatable to people who are in favor of allowing markets to make decisions. The idea is, yes, markets can make decisions, but we just have to make sure that when the actors in those markets make decisions, they're paying for all of the things they use, including the global air that they're using.
Okay, thank you, Rich, and thank you, Thomas, for your question. We much appreciate it. We have another raised hand here from Tony, Tony Hartshorn. It looks like you're unmuted, so go ahead.
Can you guys hear me?
Yes.
Hey, thanks, Rich. I thought that was a fantastic talk. Just a really quick anecdote. Last summer, we were touring Martinsdale, where this guy told us in the next couple of years, you're going to see 2,000 megawatts of wind and pump storage going around Martinsdale, right? No traffic light. Answering that last question, like, what is it that's going to make Montanans maybe sit up a little bit straighter? Like, can you connect the dots for our audience, like your audience, especially given the intro that it's the water year and the focus is on water? Like, how do we make people in Montana care a little bit more about how much water is in our rivers? Who is doing the best work connecting these potential damages, but localizing them to our snowmelt?
Well, I think that the work that Kathy Whitlock and the people she's been working with on the different versions of the Montana Climate Assessment has really done a good job, and they have been tireless in going around the state and talking to people about that. And I think that they have helped change the conversation. And what they tell me is that when they go out in the state, people get it. When they talk to growers, they get it. They know that things are changing. They know that they're having, things are getting drier faster. They know that the rivers are dropping earlier. So I think that maybe that if you get down into the communities, I think that you'll find that they understand this a lot better than maybe their elected representatives think they do.
Okay, thank you. We have a question here in the question box from Emma. who says, what's the most likely scenario regarding climate refugees in the near future?
Oh, you're talking to the wrong person on that. I mean, everything I've seen is that we would expect increases in movement as a consequence of climate. Now, one of the things about climate change is that it is going to be spotty. There's going to be places that get wetter, places that get drier. There's going to be heat waves. There's going to be storms. There's going to be natural disasters, and all of those things are going to result in people needing to move. The everything I've read suggests that climate change is going to make that problem more dramatic. But I don't have any particular expertise to go deeper than that.
Okay, I don't see any more raised hands here, but there is one more sort of comment question from Laura. She says, oh, wait, we got another question coming into then after that. Have you heard about voting reform such as open primaries and ranked choice voting as a solution to political polarization? I think we need to bring in yet another professor from the political science field possibly, but
yeah, I would love to see that comment, that seminar, because it's something that's very intriguing to me. Ranked choice voting and open primaries, I think, are a very interesting idea. So I think it's something that I would love to see that seminar, but it won't be given by me, I'm afraid.
okay. Okay, so we need to wrap up here. And so I just wanted to say thank you for coming. If you have some questions that went unanswered, Richard, I'm sure will be happy to email you with that. So once again, thank you. Look for our follow-up email that will, whoops, you know what I'm going to do? You can see me again. Here, hold on. Bye. Okay, so I just wanted to say, look for our follow-up email that will include a link to a recording of tonight's talk, and it'll provide you information about future talks. So we've learned about policies that could help with our snow and water supply, and you may be interested in exploring ways that can cut our water usage. So look up our following events. There are ones that will handle that. And also I'm remiss in saying thank you, Rich, very much for your wonderful talk tonight. And I just want people to go to our website and check out. We've got a lot of really good, interesting events online and coming up, and also in-person events. As you can see on the slide here, we've got some really fun events coming up in person to celebrate Earth Day. Join us on Friday, April 22nd at the Emerson. And then also on Saturday, the 23rd, we've got an Earth Day fun run at the Gallatin County Regional Park at 9 a.m., which is going to benefit the Montana Outdoor Science School. And then go head over at 10 a.m. to the Emerson Center for our Earth Day Festival, where there'll be food, live music, exhibits, short films, talks every hour, and children's activities with prizes and a puppet show at 10 a.m. and 10:30 a.m. If you'd like to be kept up to date on Earth Day activities, please go to our website and sign up for our monthly newsletter. And also in the follow-up email in a few days, if you could help us out by answering our very short survey on how you heard about our talk, so we know how to use our limited advertising dollars. So thanks again for joining us, and have a good night. Goodbye.